Nobody wants to have this conversation, but here we are. In a world with roughly 12,500 nuclear warheads, two major land wars running simultaneously on different continents, and geopolitical tensions that most analysts describe with words like unprecedented and fragile. It doesn't hurt to think about geography. If World War III happens tomorrow, these are the best states to hide. What actually makes a state safe? Before getting into specific states, it's worth being honest about the framework. In a full-scale nuclear exchange, no location in the continental United States is genuinely safe. John Areth, Senior Policy Director at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, said it plainly to Newsweek. Nowhere is truly safe from fallout and other consequences like contamination of food and water supplies and prolonged radiation exposure. So the question isn't about absolute safety, it's about relative safety. The places that are farthest from likely targets, least likely to be hit directly, least exposed to fallout corridors, and most capable of supporting human survival in the aftermath. The factors that drive these assessments are consistent across most analysis: proximity to military targets. The United States currently deploys 400 Minuteman III ICBMs at 3 Air Force bases: Malmstrom in Montana, Minot in North Dakota, and F.E. Warren in Wyoming, in silos spread across Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska, and Colorado. Any adversary targeting those silos is targeting those states. That's not opinion. That's documented nuclear doctrine. Adversaries would need to strike all 400 silos to neutralize the land-based deterrent. Princeton University's Science and Global Security program calculated that an attack on U.S. missile silos alone could put 300 million people across North America at radiation risk. Proximity to major urban and economic targets: Washington, D.C., New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Seattle. These are first strike targets in any realistic nuclear war scenario. Population centers, financial infrastructure, military command nodes. States that don't contain these targets or aren't geographically adjacent to them have an immediate advantage. Fallout corridors. Fallout travels with prevailing winds. In the continental United States, winds predominantly move from west to east. States downwind of major targets in the east face radiation risk from strikes that don't hit them directly. Food and water self-sufficiency. After the immediate crisis, survival depends on access to fresh water, farmable land, and a population that has the skills and infrastructure to feed itself independently. With that framework in mind, here are the states that consistently emerge at the top. Maine. Maine has a surface area of roughly 35,380 square miles, the majority of which is forested wilderness with no significant military infrastructure, no ICBM fields, no major naval bases, and no urban concentration of any consequence beyond the Portland metro area. The largest city in Maine, Portland, has a population of around 68,000. The entire state has fewer than 1.4 million residents. What Maine also has: approximately 6,000 lakes and ponds, more than 5,000 rivers and streams, a productive agricultural sector in its northern regions. Aroostook County is one of the largest potato-growing areas in the United States, and a coastal fishing economy that has operated continuously for centuries. If supply chains collapse, Maine has food and water. In fallout modeling based on attacks on U.S. missile silos and major urban centers, Maine consistently appears in the lower exposure zones. It is in the northeast corner of the country, positioned upwind of most Midwest target zones, given typical seasonal wind patterns, and far from the primary East Coast urban corridor. The prevailing winds from the west carry fallout eastward, away from Maine rather than toward it, in most modeled scenarios. Aroostook County specifically, a region the size of Connecticut and Rhode Island combined, is among the most genuinely remote inhabited areas in the lower 48. The population density there is roughly 12 people per square mile. The county produces a significant share of U.S. seed potato stock and has the agricultural infrastructure, cold storage, processing facilities, farmland, to sustain a population through a prolonged supply chain disruption. The coastline is an additional asset. The Gulf of Maine is one of the most productive fishing zones in the Western Atlantic. Cold, nutrient-rich water supports massive populations of cod, haddock, lobster, and shrimp. Coastal communities in Maine have been feeding themselves from that water for 400 years. A disruption to grocery store supply chains does not affect the ocean. Maine also sits far north enough that the summer growing season, while shorter than more southerly states, supports a wide range of food crops. The agricultural community there has historical experience with food production under difficult conditions. Short seasons, hard frosts, variable weather. That experience is an asset when planning assumptions break down. If you needed to disappear from everything that was about to happen, northern Maine is about as close to disappearing as you can get without leaving the country. Vermont. Vermont is the second least populated state in the country, with approximately 647,000 residents. Its economy is based largely on agriculture, dairy, maple syrup production, and small manufacturing. It has no major military installations, no ICBM fields, no nuclear power plants that remain operational, and no Tier 1 strategic targets of any kind. The state is 75% forested. It has abundant fresh water from rivers, lakes, and groundwater. Lake Champlain on the western border holds fresh water that could support a significant population indefinitely. The Connecticut River along the eastern border with New Hampshire is another major water resource. In between is a state of small farms, river valleys, and hills that have been sustaining human populations since the colonial era. The agricultural tradition in Vermont is genuinely old and genuinely functional. The state has more farms per capita than most of the country and a strong culture of food preservation, local production, and self-reliance that dates back centuries. Dairy farming, maple sugaring, apple orchards, vegetable production, and livestock operations are distributed across the state in ways that make agricultural self-sufficiency more achievable than in most states of comparable size. Vermont has a long tradition of independence and self-sufficiency that runs deeper than most places in America, noted emergency preparedness researcher Tom Griffith in a 2022 assessment of post-disaster resilience by state. That culture has real practical value in a sustained crisis. Vermont's position in the fallout modeling is consistently favorable. It's northeast of the major fallout corridors from Midwest silo strikes and generally upwind of the major East Coast urban targets, depending on seasonal wind patterns. The lack of any military targets within the state itself is the primary advantage. No adversary has a compelling reason to spend a warhead on Montpelier. The state's small size is also an advantage in a crisis scenario. Vermont has a relatively tight-knit rural community structure where people know their neighbors, know the land, and have the practical infrastructure. Local food systems, community wells, heating through wood rather than natural gas, that translates directly into resilience. The state consumes more firewood per household than almost any other in the country. That is not a coincidence. It is a function of necessity and culture that happens to be exactly the kind of redundant energy infrastructure that matters when the grid goes down. Idaho. Idaho presents a different kind of safety case. It's a large state, roughly 83,570 square miles, with a population of only about 1.9 million, making it one of the least densely populated states in the continental U.S. Most of that population is concentrated in the Boise metro area in the southwest corner. The rest of Idaho is mountains, forests, river valleys, and high desert. The central Idaho wilderness, the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, and the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness represents the largest contiguous roadless area in the lower 48 states, covering approximately 3.9 million acres. It is genuinely difficult to reach, genuinely difficult to track through, and genuinely capable of supporting people willing and able to live within it. The Salmon River runs through the heart of this wilderness and provides water through terrain that is among the most rugged in the country. Idaho has no active ICBM fields, no major naval installations, and minimal strategic industrial infrastructure relative to its size. The Snake River system provides extensive water access across the southern portion of the state. The agricultural output of the Magic Valley and the broader Snake River Plain, potatoes, dairy, wheat, barley, trout aquaculture, is substantial relative to the population it would need to feed in a disruption scenario. The Palouse region of northern Idaho and adjacent eastern Washington is among the most fertile dryland farming territory in the world. producing winter wheat with soil depth and quality that represents centuries of accumulated organic material. If grain production becomes the primary food source for a regional population, the Palouse is producing it. The cautionary note for Idaho is proximity to Montana and Wyoming, which host active Minuteman III fields. Prevailing winds from the northwest can push fallout from strikes on those states into northern and central Idaho, depending on conditions. However, the mountain ranges of central Idaho act as significant natural barriers. The Bitterroot, Sawtooth, and Clearwater ranges physically intercept fallout particles in ways that protect the valleys on their eastern and southern sides. Northern Idaho, in the Panhandle, has the additional advantage of being geographically separated from the Boise metro and the silo fields by 400 miles of mountain wilderness. Coeur d'Alene and the surrounding lake country offers fresh water, timber, and a small city infrastructure without being a meaningful strategic target. Wyoming. This one requires explanation because Wyoming is where the ICBMs are. F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne operates Minuteman III silos spread across an 8,300 square mile area covering Wyoming, Nebraska, and Colorado. Any adversary targeting the land-based nuclear deterrent is specifically targeting Wyoming. So why is Wyoming on this list? Because outside the silo fields in the southeast corner of the state, Wyoming is 97,914 square miles of largely empty terrain. The state has fewer than 580,000 residents, the least populated state in the country. If you are not in the silo field areas or in Cheyenne, the actual physical footprint of the targets is relatively small compared to the land available. The Bighorn Mountains, the Wind River Range, and the vast empty spaces of the Wyoming Basin and high desert offer genuine isolation. Wyoming has extensive fresh water from rivers and groundwater. The agricultural and ranching traditions are real and deep. The population has disproportionate experience with self-sufficient outdoor living relative to any other state. The calculus is stark. Stay away from the southeast corner where the silos are, get into the mountains, and Wyoming's sheer emptiness works in your favor. The wind patterns from a silo strike would push fallout eastward into Nebraska and South Dakota, rather than north and west into the mountains. This is admittedly an unusual recommendation, but the numbers support it. The silo fields are real. The rest of Wyoming is also real, and it's a lot more of the state. Montana has the same complication as Wyoming. Malmstrom Air Force Base near Great Falls operates Minuteman III silos across a large area of central Montana. Those silos are targets. Montana is 147,040 square miles. The population is approximately 1.1 million people. There is an enormous amount of state that has nothing to do with Malmstrom. The western portion of Montana, the Rocky Mountain Front, Glacier National Park area, the Bitterroot Valley, is among the most physically remote and naturally abundant terrain in the continental United States. Fresh water is abundant. Wildlife is abundant. The ranching and agricultural traditions are deep. The population skews toward people who know how to live off the land in ways that urban populations do not. Like Wyoming, the recommendation comes with a geographic caveat. The silo fields in central Montana are legitimate targets, and fallout from strikes on them would travel east on prevailing winds into North Dakota and eastern Montana, not west into the mountains. Western Montana, north of the prevailing storm track, is a different situation than the missile fields. The state also hosts no major urban targets of first strike priority. Billings, the largest city in Montana, has a population of approximately 117,000. That's not a first strike priority by any realistic nuclear targeting doctrine. Oregon's safety case is simpler than Wyoming or Montana. It has no active ICBM fields, no major nuclear installations, and outside the Portland metro area, large portions of the state are genuinely remote and self-sufficient in ways that most Americans have no frame of reference for. The eastern half of Oregon is high desert. The Oregon High Desert, covering roughly 60,000 square miles of largely uninhabited landscape. The Harney Basin in southeast Oregon is one of the most remote inhabited regions in the lower 48. The town of Burns, the largest settlement in the area, has around 2,500 people. If you wanted to minimize your proximity to anything that anyone would consider worth targeting, Southeast Oregon is a serious candidate. The Central Oregon Cascade region, the area around Bend, the Deschutes River, the Three Sisters Wilderness, offers mountain terrain, abundant water, timber, and a combination of agricultural and outdoor living capacity. The Deschutes River provides clean water through terrain that could support a significant population in a collapse scenario. The Willamette Valley in western Oregon is exceptionally productive agricultural land. Oregon's agricultural output per acre is among the highest in the country, and the valley's climate and water supply support year-round food production. The valley floor between Portland and Eugene grows hazelnuts, grass seed, Christmas trees, wine grapes, vegetables, and grains in extraordinary density. It is, essentially, a temperate breadbasket with reliable rainfall. The primary risk in Oregon is the Portland metro area, which has port infrastructure, population density, and economic significance that could qualify it as a secondary target in a full-scale scenario. Staying east of the Cascades eliminates most of that risk. Prevailing winds in Oregon blow from the west, off the Pacific Ocean, which means fallout from inland targets in Idaho and eastern Washington would generally move eastward away from western Oregon rather than toward it. Western Oregon benefits from being geographically upwind of most interior targets. That's a meaningful advantage. Oregon also has one of the most organized rural communities in the country when it comes to water rights, agricultural cooperatives, and land stewardship, a function of the state's particular history of land use disputes and rural governance. Those organizational structures translate into practical resilience when central authority becomes unreliable. Alaska. Alaska is, by sheer distance, the most isolated landmass attached to the United States. It is separated from the Pacific Northwest by more than 500 miles of Canadian territory. It has fewer than 740,000 residents spread across 663,267 square miles, the largest state in the country by a dramatic margin. Alaska does have military installations of significance: Elmendorf-Richardson, Eielson Air Force Base, Fort Wainwright, and those are targets. The state also has missile defense installations at Fort Greely, which would be a priority target for any adversary seeking to neutralize U.S. missile defense capability. This is not trivial, but Alaska outside those installations is a land of extraordinary scale and difficulty. The majority of the state is roadless wilderness. The subsistence traditions of Alaska, fishing, hunting, gathering, are still actively practiced by large portions of the rural population in ways that no other American state can match. Fresh water is effectively unlimited. Game is abundant. The brutal reality of an Alaskan winter would eliminate most people unprepared for it. But for people already adapted to Alaskan conditions, the scale of the wilderness and the distance from continental targets would be assets rather than liabilities. Fallout from strikes on the continental United States would travel east across Canada, not north into Alaska. The biggest practical problem with Alaska as a refuge is getting there. In a scenario where World War III breaks out tomorrow, the transportation infrastructure connecting Alaska to the lower 48, airports, the Alaska-Canada Highway, the ferry system, would become immediately contested and potentially closed. If you're already there, it's an asset. If you're planning to get there, you probably won't. Nebraska. Nebraska appears on some lists and not others, and the reason for the ambiguity is the same as Wyoming and Montana. It has active Minuteman III silo fields in its western and central regions, operated out of F.E. Warren Air Force Base's coverage area covering Wyoming, Nebraska, and Colorado. Those silos are targets. But Nebraska makes the list for a different reason: post-conflict survival potential at a scale that few other states can match. Nebraska sits above the Ogallala Aquifer, one of the largest groundwater systems in the world, underlying roughly 174,000 square miles of the Great Plains and saturated to depths reaching 1,000 feet in places. This is not a lake. It is an enormous underground reservoir that has been accumulating for millions of years. In a scenario where surface water sources become contaminated or unreliable, The Ogallala provides water that can be accessed by well at depths below where surface contamination typically penetrates. Nebraska's agricultural production is extraordinary relative to its population. The state ranks among the top 5 in the country for beef cattle, corn, soybeans, and pork production, consistently every year. The agriculture is not just large in scale. It is deeply mechanized and organized around independent farm operations that have the infrastructure and knowledge to continue operating when central logistics fail. Farmers who run their own operations, store their own fuel, maintain their own equipment, and grow their own feed don't stop farming because the supply chain is disrupted. They adapt. The geographic center of the United States is roughly in Kansas, making Nebraska one of the most interior states on the continent, the farthest point from any ocean, and therefore the farthest from naval bombardment or coastal strike corridors. This is either reassuring or irrelevant depending on the specific scenario. But in a scenario where the coasts are hit first, the center of the continent has time that the coasts don't. Real estate analyst Andrew Ragusa told the Daily Mail that Nebraska tops his list for survival-oriented relocation, specifically because of the combination of soil fertility, groundwater access, and agricultural infrastructure. His analysis mirrors what most serious emergency planners identify as the long-game factors, not where you want to be in the first week, but where you want to be in the first year. Tennessee and Kentucky. These two states share a survival-relevant geography that puts them in a different category than the western and northern states discussed above. Neither Tennessee nor Kentucky has significant nuclear military targets. Neither has ICBM fields. Tennessee has Oak Ridge National Laboratory and the Y-12 National Security Complex, both legacies of the Manhattan Project and both carrying some target value as nuclear research and weapons component production facilities. But they are not first strike priorities in the same tier as active ICBM fields or major naval bases. Both states sit along productive river systems. The Tennessee River flows through both states and was the subject of one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in American history, the Tennessee Valley Authority, established in 1933, which built dams, power generation, and flood control across the entire watershed. That infrastructure, hydroelectric dams, managed reservoirs, would continue producing power after the grid fails, to the extent that local distribution systems survive. Kentucky has the Kentucky River and the Cumberland River. The Ohio River along Kentucky's northern border represents one of the largest fresh water systems on the continent. Access to water at this scale is not incidental. It's the single most important resource for sustained survival after acute radiation risk passes. The agricultural capacity of both states is substantial and diverse. Tennessee produces corn, soybeans, tobacco, cattle, and poultry on a scale that vastly exceeds its current population's food needs. Eastern Tennessee's mountain economy has always required a degree of agricultural self-sufficiency that urban populations don't maintain. The Appalachian highlands of eastern Tennessee and eastern Kentucky provide natural terrain features, ridges, valleys, hollows, that offer both isolation and the kind of topographic concealment that matters in an uncertain security environment. Fallout modeling from Scientific American's analysis, reported in Newsweek, showed both Tennessee and Kentucky appearing in the lower exposure zones, far enough from the Midwest silo fields and the East Coast urban corridor to avoid the worst of the fallout patterns under prevailing wind conditions. Neither state is downwind of primary targets under typical seasonal patterns. The cultural factor is worth naming directly. These states have large rural populations with hunting, farming, canning, preservation, and self-sufficiency traditions that have genuinely deep roots, older than the American Republic itself in some of these communities. The practical skills for surviving a supply chain collapse are more broadly distributed in rural Tennessee and Kentucky than in most other comparable regions of the country. That matters when the moment arrives to use them. Mississippi and Arkansas. These two states don't get mentioned often in survival geography discussions, and that is somewhat to their advantage. They are flyover states for most people planning these scenarios, which means they are also flyover states for most targeting planners. Neither Mississippi nor Arkansas has significant nuclear military targets. Neither has ICBM fields. Neither has naval bases, major port infrastructure of strategic significance, or Tier 1 military command nodes. Both sit in a geographic middle band between the East Coast corridor and the Midwest silo fields that keeps them out of both primary target zones and primary fallout corridors in most modeled scenarios. Both states sit along the Mississippi River system, which provides water at a scale unmatched in the eastern United States. The Mississippi drainage basin covers roughly 40% of the continental United States. In a world where surface water becomes contested or contaminated in other regions, the sheer volume and distribution of the Mississippi system represents an extraordinary advantage. Clean tributaries feeding into the main channel, the Arkansas River, the Yazoo, the Big Black, provide distributed access across both states. The agricultural capacity of both states is extraordinary. The Mississippi Delta, the alluvial plain stretching from Memphis down through the western portion of the state, has some of the deepest, richest topsoil in North America, deposited over thousands of years by the Mississippi River flooding cycle. This land produces cotton, soybeans, corn, rice, and sweet potatoes in volumes that dwarf the state's population requirements. In a food production scenario, Delta farmland is among the highest value agricultural real estate in the world. Arkansas's agricultural output includes poultry, rice, soybeans, and cattle, and the state's blend of Delta farmland in the east and Ozark Highlands in the north and west provides geographic diversity. The Ozark Plateau, rising to elevations above 2,000 feet in places, offers cooler temperatures, forested terrain, clean spring water from limestone karst geology, and the kind of isolation that rural Appalachian communities have maintained for generations. The climate in both states is warm enough to support year-round food production. The growing season in Mississippi averages over 200 days per year, long enough to produce 3 crop cycles under some agricultural models. That's not a minor advantage. In a scenario where food supply chains have collapsed, the number of growing days per year becomes one of the most critical variables in a region's ability to sustain its population. The practical disadvantages of both states, infrastructure gaps, economic challenges, susceptibility to flooding along the river, are the same factors that make them less strategically significant to a targeting planner. In this particular context, being overlooked is the advantage. A word on what the experts say about safe. It's worth ending with the honest caveat that belongs at the beginning of any conversation like this. The Princeton Science and Global Security Program's analysis found that an attack targeting U.S. missile silos, not even cities, could expose 300 million people across North America to radiation. The fallout doesn't respect state lines. It doesn't respect mountains or rivers. Wind is an indifferent carrier. Braden Goddard, an associate professor at Virginia Commonwealth University's Department of Mechanical and Nuclear Engineering, pointed out to Newsweek that missile silos might not even be the primary targets in a modern conflict. Washington, D.C. would be hit first. That changes the fallout pattern considerably. A strike on the nation's capital pushes fallout east and northeast on prevailing winds, toward the Chesapeake Bay, the Mid-Atlantic, and potentially New England, rather than across the Midwest silo fields. John Erath of the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation put the honest assessment plainly. Nowhere is truly safe from fallout and the contamination of food and water supplies that follows a nuclear exchange. The states in this video are the best available options relative to each other and to the rest of the country. They are not guarantees. They are better bets. What they have in common is the fewest high-priority military and strategic targets within their borders, the greatest distance from those that exist elsewhere in the country, and the strongest inherent capacity for food and water self-sufficiency in the aftermath of a disruption. In a scenario where nothing is safe, those factors determine relative outcomes over weeks, months, and years. The geography matters. The food and water matters. The skills and traditions of the local population matter. The distance from targets matters. The prevailing wind patterns matter. None of it guarantees anything, but some places are better than others, and understanding which ones and why is the same reasoning that emergency planners and military analysts use every single day, because they understand that in a crisis, the decisions that matter most are the ones made before the crisis begins. The conversation nobody wants to have is also the one that matters when nobody is thinking about it. Geography was always destiny. In the modern world, it still is. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, hit like and subscribe. We cover the things that are worth understanding before you need to understand them. And there's more of this kind of content where this came from.